We'll start with making the forearm, the fingers, the wrist joint, and at the end, the elbow. If you notice, the distance between the elbow joint and the wrist is roughly the same as the length of your palm. We'll use this exact reference for making the arm in thread as well. For simplicity, we'll not make all 5 fingers, only 4, 3 fingers and a thumb, like what we see in some cartoons, because that's a bit easier to construct. Right. Now we'll start by taking two really long strands of thread. You can just pull a long stretch like this. There's no specific length to them, and the 2 strands which we cut out, those need not be of the same length. So I'll just cut one strand and just randomly pull another strand. Now once you've cut out the 2 strands of thread, you need to fold both of them thrice in half such that you get a column of 8 strands. As you can see, I've cut a sufficiently long length, so I have to move around a lot, but I fold in half once, twice and thrice for the first column. So I get a column of 8 threads like this one, and similarly for the other. Now once you've folded both of the pieces of thread thrice, to make the 2 columns, they look something like this. Folded in half thrice such that you get 8 parallel threads in each column. Now the length of the columns, as you can see, is a bit longer than my forearm. You can use this as a reference if you don't have a ruler handy. Right? They should be at least a foot long, because each of these will be used to make both of the arms end to end and both of the legs of your action figure. So we need to make sure that there is sufficient length over here, because we will be tying a bunch of knots in these and they will get shorter over time. Now since we took the long strands of thread and cut them at random, it's natural that one of the 2 columns which we've made is longer than the other. We'll take the shorter column over here and use this to start making the forearms. You'll notice that your column has 4 loops on each end, this being the obvious exception because these are the ends of the thread, and we will need each of these loops to make 1 finger each. Now what I'll do, I'll take one of these loops separately and move it out. What you need to do is start tying knots at the end of each of these loops. Leave a bit sticking out at the end because you don't want the knot to come undone. I'll show you what I mean. Take one knot and we tie it at the end like this. As you can see, there's a bit of thread left at the end. That's one, because we don't want the knot to come undone, because if I pull it too hard, it will just come over on the other side. The second is because if you want to give your action figure some claws, then you can glue this end of the thread and clip it to get some really sharp claws. Similar to the knot we just tied, you need to tie 2 more knots at the end. Make sure that the gap between these knots is very less and you're pulling hard enough. You can see the 2 knots are very close together. And I'll just tie another one. So the end result for one single loop looks something like this. You have 3 knots tied end to end at the end of each loop, and this would make one finger. So one finger of your action figure would look something like this. It represents the 3 different joints that you have on your own finger. You don't have to worry about that. Now we need to repeat this process for all of the loops that you see over here. And as I had mentioned earlier, you will notice that the overall column is a little shorter now because we've tied that knot at the end, which is why you needed to make sure that the column that you had originally taken was very long. Now let's jump to the end where we have tied the knots for all of them, and we have made 4 fingers on each side, 3 of which will represent the fingers and 1 will be used as the thumb. Now once you're done tying knots on all of the ends, 3 knots per end, your 4 fingers on either side would look something like this. As I mentioned, this whole column will be used to make both the arms of your action figure. So you'll need to tie fingers on both ends. And once we're done with the construction of the wrist, it would look something like this, where you have 3 fingers over here and 1 thumb. Now as you can see, all of these are very loose and disjoint at the moment. So we would have to tie an additional set of threads around it to tie all of these fingers together such that they're joined at the base, and a thumb which is joined slightly lower. Now this tying would be very similar to how you would tie a bandage around your arm if you get a sprain, right? You would take a long bandage and tie it on all ends of your arm such that it's not able to move. We'll do something very similar here, and while you're tying this, make sure you get the ends between your fingers as well, or at least the fingers of the action figure, so that we make sure that the fingers do not end up moving away from each other and they remain firmly fixed at this base, right? Now for this next step, I'll take a different colored thread so that you're able to see the difference between the previous fingers that you've made and the new tying. Now this thread need not be as long, you can just take a very small length and cut it. And I'll take this new thread, fold it in half and cut the other end. This folding in half ensures that you end up tying the same length of thread on both the wrists, so that one wrist does not end up looking a lot bigger than the other. So we first start by taking 3 of the fingers and one of these new green threads which I have picked up, and we have one end of the thread sticking out like this. Once you've done with all the wrapping, this is the end on which you will tie the knot. And as mentioned before, similar to the crepe band analogy, you tie these 3 fingers together to make the base of your wrist, and make sure that you get the ends between the fingers as well. There's 1, there's 2. So the first round looks something like this, and then you tie a couple more loops, and note that the end which I had left exposed is still sticking out. So like I said, once you're done wrapping around all of this, you will tie at this side. Sorry about that. Now the length of your wrist, if you measure on your own hand, is roughly the same as the length of your finger, and we'll approximately take the same distance before adding the thumb back in. So now this is starting to look like a hand, so once this tying is done, and again, important to make sure that you're wrapping very tightly around each of these. You have the 2 ends together over here. There's the one end you left previously and now the other one. And you can just tie the 2 together in a knot. And there you go. That's the first palm and wrist which we have just made, right? And now we'll repeat the same exercise for the other one. As mentioned before, since this one looks somewhat like a left hand palm from the structure, we need to make sure that the other one is a right hand. Now after you've tied the new thread on both of the sets of fingers, they should look something like this. I have my right arm over here and my left one over here. Now I've used two different colors of thread, the white one for the fingers and the green one for the palms and the wrist, so that you're able to differentiate what the two different steps are and where the fingers stop and the wrists begin. But if you feel like using the same color for consistency, that is entirely up to you. Now you'd notice that right now these hands look a bit odd, and that's partly to do with these ends that we'd left on all of these fingers. These are not of the same length, which is why you'd see that the right set of fingers look a bit bigger than the left ones. At this stage, I would recommend that you take a little bit of glue and glue the ends of these fingers, right, and stretch them out like this. This, like I mentioned before, we can use this kind of design to give claws to your character, and once you glue them and cut the ends, then you can decide how long the claws need to be, and accordingly you can snip those ends out. Okay, so that was a little excessive, but there we go. We just glue the ends on all of them, and when they dry up, we can take our scissors and cut these bits off. I would also recommend that instead of scissors you can use a nail clipper for this step, so that you're able to get a nice curved shape around this bit. So it actually looks like a claw at the end, but it is entirely up to you. For this particular design, we'll not have big claws, we'll only snip the ends off. And the purpose of using glue here is to make sure that these knots which you've tied, they don't come undone. Now once you've glued all the ends on your fingers and the glue's dried up, you can see that you can get these elongated kind of nails at the end of each of the fingers. To put them all at the same length, you can cut off the bits, the loose bits on each of the fingernails, depending on how much length you want for the nails or claws of your character to be. And that's it. This completes the wrists of your action figure. You can see that now they look a lot more symmetrical and uniform and of the same size. And if you're seeing that there are these bits of thread sticking out at the ends where you've tied the knots for the wrists, that's okay. You need not cut them off separately. We will be tying the new layers of threads over these, so these will be covered under. And these would be important to give a little more thickness to the overall arm. In the next video, we'll make the elbow joint and complete the forearms of the action figure.